I want to welcome you all on this, what I hear is a very nice spring afternoon. I hear we're in a little bit of competition with the sunshine outside, finally. I'm glad to see you guys. I want to welcome you all. I know there's some in our overflow room outside. I also know that there's a contingent online on Facebook Live, and I want to welcome them. Thank you for tuning in. And I especially want to welcome all of our young people in attendance for whose future we work. I want to welcome you on behalf of CEGEP Heritage College. I want to welcome you on behalf of the social science program here at Heritage College. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Indigenizing Project led by Professors Jessica Langston and Professors Adrian Aboud and graduating visual arts student Jennifer Brunette. I want to welcome you on behalf of myself, Trevor Corliss, a teacher of history here at Heritage. I want to welcome you to the 7th annual social science evening that celebrates student work. And I want to welcome you to the last of this year in our Indigenous Speakers series. It's with respect and humility here on unceded Algonquin territory to introduce our keynote speaker of the evening. Our keynote has served the justice system in Manitoba for over 25 years. He was the first Aboriginal judge appointed in Manitoba and Canada's second. He served as co-chair of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Manitoba and as Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC. As head of the TRC, he participated in hundreds of hearings across Canada, culminating in the issuance of the TRC's report in 2015. He also oversaw an active multi-million-dollar fundraising program to support various TRC events and activities and to allow survivors to travel to attend TRC events. He's been invited to speak throughout Canada, the United States, and internationally, including the Cambridge lectures for members of the judiciary of various Commonwealth courts in England. He served as an adjunct professor of law at the University of Manitoba. He was very active within his profession and his community and has won numerous awards, including the National Aboriginal Achievement Award, the Manitoba Bar Association's Equality Award in 2001, and his Distinguished Service Award in 2016. He has received honorary doctorates from 8 Canadian universities. Our speaker was appointed to the Senate of Canada on April 2nd, 2016. Without further ado, please put your hands together. Let's welcome Senator Murray Sinclair.
Let me begin by acknowledging those who invited me, the organizers, your teachers, your faculty, and also to congratulate all of your students for the work that you've been undertaking with regard to your research. I saw a bit of it when I came in the door, and I just want to tell you how much I respect the topics, particularly that you've talked about. I didn't get a chance to look at all of the displays, but I saw the variety of topics that you've undertaken to work at, and that's really quite impressive. So congratulations to all of you who are doing that, because it expands our knowledge. I want to talk a bit about the history of Indigenous people in Canada, particularly in the context of the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Talk about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions generally and their utility and role in societies around the world. But I also want to just share a few words about who I am and where I come from and what this is all about. I was a judge in Manitoba for 28 years before I decided, after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had finished, to retire. And not just to retire from being a judge, but also to retire from public life. The work of being a judge is in and of itself a challenging role to perform, but it's considered one of the most significantly respected positions in all of society. So I enjoyed the work, I enjoyed the role, and I enjoyed the fact that people would listen to the things that I would do. And also I liked law. and I liked some of the challenges that I undertook as a judge because I thought I was contributing to some of the work that needed to be done in society overall. And when I finished the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I talked to my family, my wife Catherine and our daughters, our son, and our grandchildren as well. And they could see that I was tired, and they could see that I was drained emotionally by the work that we had done. So I said, I felt that as well, and I said, well, I'm going to step back. And now I'm going to devote some time to family, because what happens when you're doing the work of being a judge, it is a challenging work, as I said, but it's also work that tends to take you away from family activities and public activities. Normally, I get involved a lot. Before I was a judge, when I was in private practice, I got involved in a lot of community activities, was on a lot of community boards and community activities that involved being out in the public and organizing things. I coached a lot of sports and helped with a lot of community groups and advocated for a lot of people and events. But I had to put all of that aside when I was a judge in order to concentrate upon the cases that I was assigned. And then during the course of my career as a judge, I was asked to undertake 3 major inquiries. Now, inquiries are a special role the judiciary gets asked to do from time to time that are very unusual, because it takes you away from the regular criminal court work and regular family court work and puts you into a public role that's different, where you have to engage in looking at things that are representative of society's ills and society's problems and come up with solutions around them. And most judges never get to do any. I was both fortunate and challenged by the fact that I had to do 3, or was asked to do 3, all of which I agreed to do. But after the last one, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I spent 7 years doing, I said, that's it, I'm going to step back and spend more time with family, because we did a lot of traveling, spent a lot of time away from home, and wanted to get to know my grandchildren and spend some time with them and do the normal things that grandfathers do and that fathers do. And so I announced publicly that I was going to retire and step back from public life. So I retired on January 31st of 2016, and on February the 8th of 2016, the Prime Minister called. So I had 8 days of retirement. And he said, I'd like to ask if you would accept an appointment to the Senate. And I said, well, I just finished the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I said, and we issued a report that's been very widely received and widely praised, and we're riding on a very big high emotionally, and this country is really eager to embrace some of the things we said. And so in my stature and reputation and my following in the community is really quite significant. And on top of that, I said, I've been a judge for 28 years, which is one of the most respected positions in society. And you want me to do what? You want me to go to the Senate? No. I said, before I do that, I need to talk to my family and see what they think, because I did make them a promise. And so when I talked to the family, I talked to the children, and they were quite supportive. They basically said, whatever you want to do, they would support it. And grandchildren were a little disappointed because they were looking forward to spending some time traveling with us, but they understood. And when I explained that they could always come to watch what we were doing in the Senate and spend some time with me in Ottawa if they wanted to, they were a little more enthusiastic. And then I spoke to my wife, Catherine, and I said, so what do you think? And she said, well, you've been retired for 8 days, and you've organized the cupboard 3 times. I think you should go back to work. Because I can't find a damn thing. No, I said, okay, I'll do that. So the work at the Senate is a bit different than the work that I was doing at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So let me tell you a bit about the TRC. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions have been used by governments in Canada since the early 1960s. And they followed essentially on the impact of the Nuremberg trials following the Second World War. Those of you who may have taken a look at the Nuremberg trials will know that they were an international court that was established in order to prosecute war criminals who had undertaken atrocities and managed atrocities during the Second World War, particularly Nazis who participated in the Holocaust. And while there were lists of literally thousands and thousands of people who participated in those atrocities, Nuremberg trials only ended up prosecuting a few dozen people. And out of that, a handful of people were convicted who were given the ultimate sanction, which was the death penalty. But a number of people were prosecuted and sentenced to lengthy periods of imprisonment. And a number of people weren't convicted at all or never even prosecuted. And so there was a general level of international dissatisfaction with proceeding criminally to try to achieve justice coming out of significant events like that, because the population of people affected by the events of war and the political activities that led up to the war were much more significant than those who may have felt they received justice through what happened to those who were prosecuted during the trials. And that was true as well with other experiences of other prosecutions that came out of military activities going back into the 19th century. And so internationally they grew this movement to try to do something in response to the acts of genocide and acts of inhumanity to mankind, crimes against humanity as it came to be known, that so often happened during wartime military activities or military dictatorships. And so the first idea of establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission took place in Chile in the early 1960s, following the overthrow of a dictatorship there. Most people know about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which took place in the 80s and 90s, but the first one took place in the 1960s, and there were altogether, to this point in time, about 67 or 68 Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that have taken place, some with different titles or different purposes and mandates, but all with the primary responsibility to assist a country to move from one era of governance to a new era of governance that will appease the population in such a way that acts of vengeance, which might lead to further military reprisals or military activity, would be reduced. Canada was one of the few nations that established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, not for purposes of moving from one regime to another, but for moving from one era of governance to another era of governance for the purpose of trying to deal with historical wrongs. So that was a uniqueness about it. Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission also came about because it was part of a court settlement. Following the era of Confederation, when Confederation occurred in 1867, Canada entered into a number of treaties with First Nations people, particularly in Western Canada, but also in Eastern Canada. And those treaties were established for the purpose of dealing with the issue of Indigenous title to the lands that they had historically owned and had never been satisfied through payment. So there had never been any recognition of their right to title. There had never been any recognition of their right to compensation for the taking of their lands and their resources. And so beginning in 1867, treaties started to be entered into And in particular, when Canada wanted to expand into when the Dominion of Canada wanted to expand into the west, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, which were then called the Northwest Territories, and British Columbia, which was a colony in and of itself, there was a provision in the Manitoba Act of 1869, or the British North America Act of 1869, which required Canada, in order to expand into the West, to enter into treaties to resolve the question of Indian title, as it was referred to. So those treaties were entered into, and initially when you look at the documents, they look like land transfer agreements. Simply, we give up our title to the land in exchange for a certain amount of money. But when the first negotiators went out to the West to sign those treaties, they had prepared documents to take for the Indigenous people to sign, and they actually had signatures on the documents to ask the Indigenous people simply sign here so we can have title to your land. But the Indigenous negotiators said, no, not so fast. We want other terms included in the treaties. Treaty number 1 is the best example of what took place. And that process of Treaty number 1 is recorded historically in several records. But there were provisions added to the original document, one of which was called the Schools Clause. Indigenous leaders in Western Canada wanted their children to be educated. And they wanted their children to be educated so that they could participate in society on the same basis as the little white children. That was their terms. So they wanted their children to be able to be educated in the same way that the little white children were educated, so that they could become true partners in this new relationship that was being formed. And so they negotiated a Schools Clause. In the Schools Clause, there was a promise made by the government that they would build schools for the Indigenous populations on the reserves that they agreed to move to, in return for which they would give up their claim to all of the rest of the territories. And those Schools Clauses are contained in all of the Western Canada treaties. And they're included in some of the Eastern Canada treaties that were negotiated after Confederation as well. Those Schools Clauses are very important, and they were important to the Indigenous leaders because they represented a commitment to education that they were prepared to make, but in their communities. So it was their insistence that those schools be located in their communities. Government of Canada, instead of carrying out the promises made in the treaties, decided to build schools far away from the reservations that were created by the treaties and put those Indigenous children into institutions called industrial schools and training schools, and eventually called residential schools. And they were for the purpose of taking the children away from the communities and placing them in those institutions called residential schools, so that they could be removed from the influence of their families, their communities, their elders, and their parents, and be indoctrinated into this new Canadian society. And that indoctrination was to be completed by Christianization. Government believed, Sir John A. Macdonald in particular, was a very strong advocate of the belief that Indigenous people were inferior. Now, he wasn't the only one who believed that. Other people believed that who were in government as well. That Indigenous people were intellectually, socially, culturally, politically inferior to the European societies that had come here prior to Confederation. And that their inferiority could only be compensated for by training them to be able to be the menial labor force of Canada. So young children were being taken away to be civilized, to be indoctrinated into a new culture, but also to be given enough education so that they could be the lower peasant class of Canadian society. That was the purpose of residential schools. So when you look at the history of residential schools, you can see that language was prohibited, culture was prohibited, isolation occurred from families, culture, community, language, history. They were never taught anything about their communities, about themselves. And they were forced to learn a different language in English schools primarily. They were taught about England. They were taught how to speak English. They were prohibited from speaking their own languages. French schools that were run by Catholics, they were taught to speak French, and they were taught about the history of France. They were taught about the means that they would be allowed, the terms upon which they would be allowed to participate in Canadian society. Nobody ever graduated from a residential school and successfully went to university based on that education, ever throughout its terms. Residential schools were in existence from the 1880s until 1996, when the last school closed down. Those who graduated or finished their education in those schools had to go to other schools in order to get their high school equivalency and be able to go to university. There were lots of laws that were put in place that supported the schools, so it was made mandatory for the parents of those children to send their kids to the schools that were required by the Minister of Indian Affairs. Any parent who didn't send their child to the schools could be prosecuted. And in the work that we did at the TRC, we found records of lots of parents who were locked up and held in custody until they agreed to tell the Indian agent where their children were, in order that the children could be rounded up and taken away to the schools. The children initially were kept away from their parents for lengthy periods of time, sometimes years. Inuit children from Baffin Island, for example, were sent to residential schools in Edmonton or Yellowknife and never saw their parents, some of them never again, but most of them for years. Inuit children were sometimes sent to residential schools in Quebec, and sometimes brothers and sisters of those children were sent to schools in Edmonton and Yellowknife. And so when they returned to their communities, sometimes they couldn't talk to each other because the English children who were trained in the Western schools couldn't speak French. French children who were educated in the Quebec schools couldn't speak English, and none of them could speak Inuit, so they couldn't even talk to their parents. So as a result, family disruption was quite significant. In the schools themselves, of course, children were disciplined harshly. They were punished physically for trying to speak their language, for feeling the sadness of being separated from their family, and harshly disciplined for that. And if they complained, then they would be punished for that as well. Brothers and sisters couldn't talk to each other, couldn't relate to each other. They were separated. Older children were separated from younger children. And all of that included the fact that they were separated from their families. So their individual ability to cope with being in a school far from their homes, far from their families, was magnified by the fact that they couldn't even talk to their brothers and sisters who were in the same school. All of that had a toll that was exacted on each of them. So imagine what it would be like for you if you were, as a little child, taken away from your family and placed in an institution where you couldn't talk to your brother or your sister, you couldn't speak your own language, you had to speak another language, your religion was taken away from you, you were punished if you tried to resist, and you were also malnourished because they didn't feed you properly, you were poorly clothed, disease was rampant in the schools, children died in large numbers, we know that. Many tried to run away, didn't make it home. If that only happened for 1 or 2 generations, you might have been able to get over it. You might have been able to cope with it. But those schools were in place from 1880 till 1996. 116 years. Almost 7 generations of children went through those schools. So each succeeding generation, when they returned home to family members and community members who themselves had been taken away and placed in residential schools. And so more and more suffering was inflicted upon younger and younger generations of children, until we see the results that we have today. And what is it that we have today? We have the highest suicide rates among young people anywhere in the world in Indigenous communities. We have the highest rates of child welfare apprehensions. Almost 50% of all the kids who are in child welfare care in Canada are Indigenous kids. And yet we represent only about 5% of the entire population. Medical problems are rampant. We suffer from diseases that other people don't hear about anymore. Tuberculosis is a serious problem in many Indigenous communities. In addition to that, we have the highest incarceration rates. In Western Canada, about 70% of the men who are locked up in jails and prisons are Indigenous men. About 80% of all the young people who are locked up in Western Canada are Indigenous boys and girls. And about 90% of all the women who are incarcerated in Western Canada are Indigenous women. And why is it so bad in the West compared to the East? Because the numbers aren't that high in the East. Well, it's because 70% of the residential schools were built in Western Canada. It's part of Confederation's expansion. That's what they did. They concentrated their efforts on the population in the West. Because by the time of Confederation, Canada had already established a presence in the East. They needed to establish a presence in the West, and that's how they did it, was through the use of residential schools. But think about this for a moment. If you were a parent of a child who experienced that in school, what would you do about it? You'd go and try to get those children out of that school. So in the 1880s, they passed a law that said any parent who resisted sending their child to the school would go to jail. But any parent who went to a school and took their child out without permission from the government would also go to jail. And if you went to the school and tried even to talk to your children, you could be prosecuted as well, because they created what they called the Indian Pass system. And that meant that in order to leave your reservation, you had to get written permission from the Indian agent first. And nobody ever got permission to go and get their kids out of the schools. And if your community happened to still try to practice its own religion, because remember, they suppressed their culture and religions in the schools, but they also did it back in the communities. You know the expression, it takes a village to raise a child? Well, if you take the children away and take them away from the villages, that's one thing. But you also have to destroy the villages they're going to return to. And that's what they tried to do. Because they passed a law that said adults who tried to practice their customs could be prosecuted, because you were not allowed to practice your customs in the ordinary way. They passed a law in the 1880s that made it illegal to practice your customs, your religion, to go to sun dances, to go to potlatches, became against the law. The wearing of traditional Indian garb by Indigenous people was against the law. They passed a law that said you cannot wear your traditional clothing. Now, mind you, if you were a white guy and you wanted to dress up like an Indian, you could do that. But Indigenous people could be prosecuted simply for dressing up and wearing their own traditional clothing. So you don't see chiefs in the pictures in the 19th century wearing their war bonnets, for example. You see it a lot now, but they didn't do it in the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century, because it was against the law. And not only that, but then they took away the powers of the leaders of the community, because in the 1890s, they passed a law called the Indian Advancement Act. And the Indian Advancement Act said that traditional Indigenous leadership could no longer exercise power. Only those people elected under the Indian Act by rules established by the Minister of Indian Affairs were allowed to hold office. And they could only hold meetings if they gave notice to the Indian agent. And the Indian agent had the right to attend the meetings, and if he attended, it was always a man, if he attended, he chaired the meeting. And he kept all the notes and the minutes of the meeting. He kept all the documents. They couldn't keep documents in their own buildings. And so, bit by bit, the government not only undermined the children in their sense of self, they undermined the community as well. And so when I was growing up, nobody in our community practiced our traditional Indigenous culture. Nobody. I can remember in the 1950s when I was a little boy that my grandmother stopped us from going to a gathering where there were men and women who were holding a powwow, because she said, even though it was not then against the law, 1951 they changed the law, but she said, you're going to get into trouble if you go over there. And so she wouldn't allow us to. In the 1950s, there were no powwows, no celebrations. 1960s, there were very few of them as well. It wasn't until the 1970s, after the white paper that was issued by the government of Canada in 1969, which proposed that Indigenous people be totally assimilated into Canadian society, and Indigenous people resisted it. And they actively resisted it not merely politically, but also socially by beginning to stand up for themselves, culturally and socially and politically. Do we begin to see the revival of those cultures? And that was the time when I started university, in that era. And that was the time that I became aware of some of this history and how it affected my own life. But you see, the other thing to keep in mind is that it wasn't just Indigenous people who were affected by what went on in those schools, because the same message that Indigenous people were inferior, that Indigenous people were pagans, they were heathens, they were savages, that they were uncivilized, that very same message was taught in the public schools. And I went to public school, and I remember those messages being given. And those of us who were Indigenous, who went to public schools, we got the same message of inferiority. And we grew up with that. But in perhaps an unintended consequence, or perhaps not, the non-Indigenous children also received that message. And they were taught that Indigenous people were inferior, Indigenous people were heathens, were savages, that they were irrelevant to Canadian society. We were taught that we were irrelevant to Canadian society. And so as a result, our relationship with each other, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, has been hampered by all of this. And what's the legacy from all of that? I want you to watch this video, because this video is going to teach you and show you what's going on today that reflects the result of all of that. And then we'll talk about the video.
murmur clears the bones cry out. So only what happened to us be forgotten.
There's an expression that those in the domestic violence field have coined, based upon a movie, I think, from the 1960s. The expression is called gaslighting. Don't know if you've ever heard of that expression or not. Look it up. Read it. Read about it for yourself. Essentially, gaslighting is when a relationship of domestic violence is occurring, but the victim of the domestic violence, the victim of the efforts by the other party to the relationship, becomes so ingrained into the relationship that the victim believes that everything is her fault or his fault. The victim believes that the relationship is deteriorating and that they deserve what they're getting. They deserve the treatment they're getting. The gaslighting is that they come to believe in a certain set of circumstances that are so false that they are true. They are so out there that they must be true because that's the only way to explain what's going on today. And for the longest time, Indigenous people have lived in a relationship like that with Canadian society, where we came to believe the perpetrators. We came to believe what Canadian society taught us and told us. And why not? It's what we were taught in schools from the very time we were born till the time that we died. Canadian society believed that we were inferior. Canadian society believed that we did not have the capacity to deal with our own issues. Canadian society taught us that we were responsible for our own inevitable self-destruction. And it was our fault. Everything going on was our fault. Nothing was anybody else's fault. It was all our fault because there was something wrong with us. That's what we were led to believe. And to a certain extent, that's what Canadian society led itself to believe, that there was something wrong with Indigenous people. Something about Indigenous people that required governments to intervene to protect them from themselves. That's why child welfare rates are so high. Social workers regularly intervene when they don't need to because they believe that Indigenous mothers cannot take care of their babies. In Manitoba, a newborn infant born to an Indigenous mother is apprehended by the child welfare authorities every single day. So today, somewhere in Manitoba, a newborn was apprehended by a social worker, not because of anything the mother has done, not because of any allegation of abuse, not because of anything the mother has threatened to do, but simply because the social worker believes that this mother will not be able to raise her child, that she is incapable of being a mother. And therefore, it's in the child's best interest that we take this child away from her, place this child in care, put this child with a foster family somewhere, and then see what happens. That happens all the time. 370 apprehensions a year of newborns. These are children that are born and never leave the hospital with their mothers. It's amazing. It's amazing that we have come to that, and it's all because of this. It's all because of this history. We have social workers who mean well, who are trying to do good, But they are instructed to believe that if you do not intervene and apprehend this child and that child is hurt, then it's your fault. Because you shouldn't have trusted that mother at all. And often the case is that the mother herself has been in child welfare custody, and sometimes still is at the time the child is apprehended. So the child is in the hospital. The mother has just come out of child welfare, has been a foster child, and the child welfare worker apprehends the baby, saying, "We have failed you as a client because you are not capable of raising your child. Even though we took you away when you were a child and raised you in our system, we believe that we didn't raise you right. So therefore, we're going to take away your baby from you." Talk about a self-perpetuating philosophy, right? As long as they have a steady clientele of such cases, child welfare workers will never lack for work. Never. It's like, when you put somebody on probation for the rest of their life, and one of the terms of probation is you can't leave your house for the rest of your life, or for 3 years, or for 2 years, or for 1 year. You have to stay inside. We're going to put you on a curfew. You have to be inside your house. Well, who the heck is going to be able to stay inside their house all the time? Very few of us. If I put that condition on you guys as a judge, I can guarantee you that probably 3/4 of you or more are going to end up in jail, because if we watched you closely enough, we would see you breaking that law. In fact, I can guarantee you this: if I watched you closely enough every day for the next year, I would find each and every one of you breaking a law. Each and every one of you. Because we allow ourselves to think that it's okay, we'll be a little slack here. We'll cut them loose. We'll cut them some slack. We'll let them do what other people are doing, but we might warn them. But each and every day, somebody somewhere is breaking a law that somebody else would go to jail for. And those children that are being apprehended are being put into the system. And they're not being put in with their larger family. You have aunts and uncles, right? You have cousins, you have relatives, you've got older brothers and sisters. If you're a newborn and you have a brother or sister who's 20, 30 years old, or an aunt who's 20 or 30 years old, and if your mother is having trouble raising you, history shows that the aunts will step in, the grandmother will step in and help the mother with the child. Families do not abandon their children. Neither did ours. I was born in 1951. My mother died in 1952, 3 weeks after my brother was born. And we were raised by our grandparents. No child welfare worker came to apprehend us. Instead, my father went to his mother and said, "I can't take care of my children. Can you help me?" And so my grandmother, who was 63, and my grandfather, who was 69, took us in and raised us. Now, they didn't do it themselves. They had a house full of young women, my aunties, to help. And each one of us was assigned to one of those aunties. Right? My Auntie Josephine was a teacher. When I was 12 years old, you know what she got me as a gift? I was hoping for a bicycle. You know what I got? A book of knowledge. A complete encyclopedia, 24 volumes. And she said, "You read this year." I had to read that complete book of knowledge over the course of that year. Because she was a teacher. And she wanted me to get an education. She wanted me to learn. And so I did. But Not everybody had that opportunity. And today, very few kids being apprehended have that opportunity, because the system is learning now how to feed on itself. And we have to stop the system from feeding on itself, because the system created this legacy, and it will continue to perpetuate this legacy unless we stop it. So we have to stop the child welfare system from continuing to apprehend kids in these large numbers, and to learn how to work with families so that they can find an auntie, they can find a grandmother, or they can find a cousin who can take care of that baby inside that family. Because you know what happens? 70% of all cross-cultural adoptions break down in the teenage years. When kids hit puberty, when kids start to think for themselves, they start to challenge, they start to ask themselves questions about their natural families. It's inevitable. They want to know. Good families will help them find out. Healthy families are not afraid of the risks that entails. But many don't. Sometimes because they don't know. Often because they don't care. But still, cross-cultural adoptions break down at 70% in the teenage years. And those kids end up back in care. So when you hear about teenage kids, like you saw in the video, back on the street, living the street lifestyle, in gangs, in drugs, prostitution, being victimized by other people, being murdered, being lost, being part of the human trafficking trade, it's because at some point, I can guarantee you, those children were probably child welfare foster children, and their foster placements broke down, or they ran away because the foster placement wasn't going well. Or they may have run away from their own family because their own families couldn't get the help that they needed to deal with the children. Because people who have come from this legacy, who are trying to cope, and who themselves have been raised by families who don't know how to raise children, because when you live in an institution, it doesn't teach you how to raise children, then the coping problems are going to be enormous. And so I want you to understand something, if nothing else, out of all of this. It is that the situation that Indigenous people find themselves in today is not their fault. It's because of this history of oppression, denial, and constant gaslighting that has gone on, that Indigenous people are struggling to find themselves, to gain their self-respect, to be able to reestablish themselves as equal partners in this confederation, which was what was intended in the treaties after this country was created. So I said that I would leave some time for questions and answers, but I'm probably going to fail you in that regard because I only have about 3 minutes left. But I do want to thank you for letting me be part of this day, and I hope that I've contributed to your knowledge in some way, and I'll leave it to your organizers to decide how much more time you want to spend with, they'll let you spend with me. Or make me spend with you. I'm not sure how this works. Or make you spend with me. So. But thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Maybe we have a couple minutes. If there's any personal questions over there, I encourage you to pose them. And if you could pose them for our audience online at the microphone here at the front. Any questions in a couple minutes?
He's just going to the washroom.
Thank you very much for a very informative talk. My question is simple. What gives you hope at this point?
I'm sorry, what?
What gives you hope at this point?
What gives me hope? So the question is, what gives me hope? It's these young people here. They give me hope. Because now you know, right? And you're going to do something about this, right? Of course they are. Now they know. That's what gives me hope.
My name is Matthew Andrew. I teach political science here. My question, I studied a lot of TRC in other parts of the world, and the main question I wrestled with was, how do we assess the success or failure of a TRC process? So I would ask you what kind of indicators you're looking for to kind of determine or to make an assessment in your mind if the TRC was a success or a failure.
Reconciliation is about changing our relationship. And there is no issue of success or failure when it comes to that. It is the relationship. So the real question is, what kind of relationship are we having, and what kind of relationship are we going to have? So I suppose the real question is not how do we measure success from a TRC initiative, but it's how do we measure change? And I think the question is really going to be, what has changed? Has anything changed in the last 2 years since the TRC report? And the answer to that question is significant change has occurred. This kind of dialogue, for example, didn't occur 10 years ago. It wasn't occurring 10 years ago. People didn't know this truth 10 years ago. And in 10 years from now, the conversation will be different then. And the young people at that time will be having a different emphasis upon their wishes for the future than this particular group, because this particular group is going to struggle with the question of, what can I do about it? What do we do about this? And the answer to that question is, you do whatever you can. But the first thing you have to do is you have to learn about this. You have to know about this, and you have to share this with everybody that you know, because we are still in that truth determination and truth sharing phase. Until we have truth widely known and widely accepted, and the widely known is the issue, until we have that, then our foundation for decision making is not going to be well established. And it's the decision making based upon this truth that's going to be our measure of change. And so I would say to all of the young people who are here, now that you know, you cannot unknow this. You will do something about it, whether you know it or not, because you are forever changed with this knowledge. And so the question becomes, how is it going to change you? What are you able to do with this? And it starts with you beginning to develop some relationships with other people utilizing this information. So, thank you.
I'd like to, Senator Sinclair, I'd like to thank you on behalf of everyone in this room. I'd like to thank you on behalf of those online. I'd like to thank you for speaking the truth for a number of years. I want to thank you for giving voice to survivors. I want to thank you for employing us to take up the calls for reconciliation. And thank you for your time on a beautiful spring afternoon. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.